Loneliness is becoming an epidemic, with 70% of Americans talking about feelings of chronic loneliness, with meaningful friendships with whom one can share anything and count on support reducing by half over the last numbers of decades. It's a problem. And there are a number of forces in conventional, in the status quo cult framework that generate loneliness. One of them is everyone's watching their own media. Because if you're watching channel 549 and someone else is watching channel 487, and you're spending hours a day in front of your camera or your screen, you're living in very different worlds from the person right next to you. And there's no framework, as we have bifurcated the mental landscape into well over 1,000 channels of distinct thoughts and paradigms. There has not been any effort to bridge the gap. So this is one force in loneliness. Another is in the exponential growth of the species on the planet. We have a lot of living in cities. And my experience is that the more one is living in a crowded environment, the less one knows the people around you or around one. And so one can live in a crowded apartment complex and not know your own neighbors. One can live in a neighborhood and not meet the neighbors. And this is a divergent path from most of human history, where we lived in small clusters of people, or we lived in small clusters of people, and the human brain cannot intimately track, this is Dunbar's research, more than around 150 people. You can't remember child's names, birthdays, wedding anniversaries, key personality traits, understand what people are doing, with more than, at most, 150 people. And so when work environments are often in, companies that have far more than 150 employees, when neighborhoods have far more than 150 people, when you can go to a Walmart or a Target and you never see the same people twice, there's a dissociation that is being lived out day to day that is generating chronic, manufactured loneliness. And so this framework, this design of a 10X community is the antithesis. It is medicine for many of these things. It's also the case that, with housing becoming a business rather than a community, many landlords do not allow dogs, for example. It's perfectly obvious. When the goal is not to create maximum human well-being, but to generate the highest profit out of the smallest amount of square feet, then a barking dog that alerts and creates an issue with several of your tenants becomes something to ban. And so now we dissociate more than ever before with animals. And 100 years ago, we might be working with and riding horses, tending dogs, shearing sheep, etc. And because our biology, we have hundreds of millions of years of interconnected history with animals. And we have less than a couple hundred years of bifurcation from our animal history. It's another form of dissociation from large portions of our own biology and our own psyche. The personas that develop in relationship with nature and with animals do not develop in a relationship with a dissociated city. So what's the remedy, and what are some of the key things? Number one, limiting size to 150 maximum size before another community diverges. And this encourages diversity and evolution of community. It's absolutely wonderful if a third of the community decides to go off and start another community that is specializing more on, noise, music, and the younger generation is just one example of a possible theme that, might not, coalesce in intergenerational, initial form of the community. And so diversity and breaking is an important part of growth and evolution. And so it's incredibly healthy if a group of community members do want to leave. But the benefit is intimacy. Into-me, you see, is only possible when you're dealing with the same people day after day and understanding the many intimate facets of those individuals over time. So limiting to size, number one. Increasing proximity, increasing exposure to those people, because it doesn't mean anything to limit the neighborhood to 150 people and then everyone gets up in the morning, gets in their car, drives somewhere else, comes back late at night, sits in front of their own private media, and then goes to sleep after talking remotely on their phone to people who aren't there. I mean, this is not, in and of itself a solution. But by organizing so that 70% of all jobs are on site, and the roughly 70-person scale is also, there's a way that machines depersonalize even something like baking. I love cooking for a partner, but when I've cooked for 20 or 30 people alone, it starts to become a chore. It starts to become not about enjoying the process and connecting and exploring, and it becomes, we've got to do this and this and this and do this batch to get it done, right? And the bigger the group of people that one is making food for, giving massage to, the more it moves from, a very personal and meaningful experience to a mechanized machine, something to be gotten done because it needs to be done. That is not pleasurable because that's not the point. The point is it needs to be done. We need to make 3,000 croissants and ship them out to all the various stores. Well, you can't have a personal relationship with 3,000 croissants. But, to have a baker that bakes delicious food and organizes some of their recipes to, people who love certain things and does a little of this on Tuesdays because, Sarah J. loves to have, Danish pastries. And so that's kind of worked into and because there's knowledge. Well, this becomes a more meaningful experience. And so, but it's big enough that someone who loves baking can bake 4 hours a day and bring richness into the community through baking. And someone who loves to cook can do that. And someone who loves, spending 4 hours a day growing vegetables, typically, then you have way too much vegetables, but you can share that with community. And so it's big enough to specialize, but small enough to have more meaning. And the greatest loneliness of all is being disconnected with oneself. And one disconnects with oneself when one doesn't want to make 3,000 croissants, but one buries the feeling of what one desires to get through the day. One doesn't want to get in the car and drive in traffic for 2 hours to get to work. But if you don't, you'll be homeless, so you do it out of fear. You lose touch with desires, with meaning, and gain touch with expediency and obligations. So the experience of creating a life that is desirable is also the experience of embodying. Because when one lives a toxic, mediocre life, just to get by, to survive, then one must dissociate and medicate in order to not feel how miserable, how empty, how lonely that is. But when one is getting up and excited about living one's life, someone's home, you're not alone because you're there with yourself. Now, I also find that, because I suffer great loneliness in the cult of America, in so many different facets of invisibility and mediocrity, the narrowness of what's on offer to go talk politics, to get a bite, to catch a movie, to text. It's just so thin. That my dog, in many ways, is more satisfying than any American that I know. And that's not speaking. It's wonderful for dogs, and I think animals, unfortunately, in the chauvinism of evolutionary hierarchy, the idea is that people must be better than animals because they have more mental activity. And the mind in chauvinism is more important than feelings or the body. To elevate the mind is the great aspiration of the chauvinistic elements of Western culture. And so this creates a blind spot. The reality is that my dog is less taxing, meaning he doesn't bring up feelings of loneliness or impatience and irritability and all the various things of kind of trying to navigate the cult, and brings delight and enthusiasm. And my dog is a role model for me. He always seeks to be close. He likes to be engaged. He loves to be connected. He likes to play. He loves playing games, and he's very enthusiastic about various things. He enjoys taking naps. He's a great role model, for how to improve my own life. And so the community will definitely have, a number be set up, because many places that I've lived, they're just not set up for animals. And, my experience is of a certain alivening. I think that depression is much more difficult when you're around healthy beings. And to a large extent, like, have you ever seen a depressed chicken? I haven't. I'm sure isolated, traumatized dogs can be depressed by human beings. But have you ever seen a depressed wild dog? And so, creating those dynamics in the larger culture, by creating a safe fence where the animals can roam freely within the community, professionally training the animals so that they can live together and different people can bond with different animals, making sure that it's, that the animals are treated well and healthy and are safe and, are invited in all the various arenas of the community. So animals, limiting size, doing work on site, eating together, having engagement together, connecting through an intranet, via the app. And I think the other thing is to acknowledge that in many ways feelings are produced ecologically. I mean, it's not an accident that 70% of Americans feel chronically lonely. That's a tremendous amount of orchestration. And there's very little intentional medicine about that. And so it's also not an action that the majority of people in the community are feeling a certain way. And so it's very important. One of the isolating aspects of Western culture is the overemphasis on the individual and the underemphasis of the circle. That's part of chauvinism, because you have the point that emerges out of the circle, that's the individual, and you have the circle that emerges out of the individual, and that's the feminine principle. And so simply by owning the group's feelings so that, basically, whether it's metadata or transparent data, each person can decide, how, visible they want to be to whom. But metadata is always visible. That you can, just fill out a 1 to 10 scale once a week and get a readout. 1 to 10, how much loneliness exists in the community. And if loneliness is bubbling up for an individual or for the community as a whole, then you come together to heal loneliness through transparency. I also think that, going back to that losing oneself, when living expenses get so high that you're frantically moving around trying to make enough money to afford your lifestyle, you're exhausted. You don't have time at the end of the day to have a 3-hour conversation. And I know this because while I've very consciously structured my own life so that, I work maybe 3 hours a day, and then I do things like this, for another hour or so a day. If I did 8 hours of work, I would not be making this video. It would be exhausting rather than an interesting and fun thing to do and see where it goes. That's, a more creative response. Now, I know that the Americans around me are exhausted and overbusy because 90% of them reject spontaneous quality time 90% of the time. If I write to someone and say, hey, let's do this, the response is, text me next week. Meaning it's always in the future. It's never now. Well, that's another way to create loneliness, because you're here in the now, but you don't get to relate to let's do this now. You have to relate to what you think you might want to do in the future with someone else who thinks they might want to do it in the future. And what this means is you very well may get to the plan, the future, and neither one of you feels the spontaneity of desire that you would have felt if you did it last week when you had the feeling. So there's a dissociation with one's feelings in the loss of quality time. And this is so painful and alienating, so dissociative between body and impulse and feelings, that I literally traveled to Thailand for months at a time, specifically to experience 1,000% more quality time spontaneously with the Thai instead of Americans. So the protocols below, of course, go into more detail about that and can continue to evolve, but creating a 10 times less lonely and a 10 times more integrated, more transparent and intimate culture is so easy. And in some ways, it's about going back to our history and our tribal nature, etc. In some ways, it's about going forward. But we already know the recipes for millions of years when very few people felt lonely.